today to talk really about digital collaboration, particularly around the themes of art and science. So, to give you a little bit of background around what complete anatomy is, with the advent of digital, it's kind of permeated, our lives in so many different ways, and it has also had a major impact on education. Students today go to YouTube, they go to apps rather than just picking up a textbook. And this has become particularly important in the field of anatomy education. Usually, the gold standard in anatomy education is dissection, but that's becoming harder and harder to acquire for universities. It's more expensive, and there's more students. So, what we try to do is to create a 3D representation of the human body, something accurate that students can actually learn from. Over the last so many years, we've actually been acquired by Elsevier, the world's largest medical publisher. And in that time, we've been very fortunate that we've been able to work on several different projects, which has expanded complete anatomy from interactive radiology features, an atlas inspired by the famous textbook Gray's Anatomy, and more recently, the creation of a full female model and also models of diverse backgrounds, which I hope will become important later on during the talk. But just to give a little bit of, what our vision is or what we hope to achieve, we really just hope to combine art, science, and technology to create a AAA product and one which will change the face of medical education worldwide. Lofty goals, I know, but we really just hope to educate, engage, and infuse students and also challenge their preconceptions of the human body. Mainly that normal anatomy does not have to be taught on a male Caucasian, as has been typically the case, up until very recently. So, a little bit of background, on who we are. So, Gustav and I, we both lead a team of 3D artists and medical professionals, respectively. My team would have backgrounds in anatomy education, and some would be doctors. And on Gus's team, a wide dynamic team of artists with various skill sets. So before I go further on into the presentation, I'd like to recommend highly this TED Talk by Vanessa Ruiz. In this TED Talk, Vanessa talks about the art history around anatomy and all the different mediums and how anatomy has been communicated, throughout time. In that, she talks about the famous woodcuts by Andreas Vesalius, the illustrations of Henry Gray, leading to Gray's Anatomy's textbook, and then also the more accessible and colorful illustrations of Frank Netter, which probably sits on most medical students' bookshelf. But she doesn't. But she pauses and she doesn't tend to talk about what might come in the future. And I think at 3D for Medical, we certainly have a goal where we would like to be the next stage in evolution of anatomical communication, using 3D technology as a new medium to help communicate that in a really new and engaging way. And we hope to do that through various different principles that we've kind of picked up and learned over the last several years. Number one, we want to be a gold standard. Anatomical education has to be accurate because we're training the next generation of doctors and medical professionals. So we have a very high standard of what we will accept. At the same time, we want the model to be beautiful and aesthetic. So it's welcoming and appealing to students and users so they feel like they want to learn. We also want the model to be simple, that it can draw the eye of the user to particular points of interest, and it's designed in such a way that it just works. But at the same time, we want to be able to layer on information, different layers of complexity to the model in such a way that students don't feel over encumbered, but they feel like they can gradually learn more and more. And we do all of this by hopefully having a dynamic team, individuals from different backgrounds who can come together and think creatively and about how we can create this content and empower it. So starting with the medical team, what we do is we really get our heads into the textbooks. So we would use textbooks such as Gray's Anatomy, Netter, But we also dive into different anatomical papers and surgical journals to get very specific information. We rely heavily on a lot of visual information and reference points, such as radiology from MRI scans, CT scans, and hundreds of different photo references. So it's our job to really assimilate this information and then turn it into a set of instructions for the artist. Now, it would be no good at all if the medical team just took verbatim what's in a textbook, because that information is dense, it's heavy, and it's full of technical jargon, which if we use that, we wouldn't be able to create the models we do. So instead, what we do is we take that information and we break it down. And instead of giving a lecture on anatomy, we almost create architectural blueprints that break it down into component parts and help build up a picture. So, for instance, in the top left image, we're talking about a very important piece of connective tissue called the thoracolumbar fascia. And what we've done here is we've drawn on the model, we've used cross sectional images, and we also use schematic images showing different modalities that will help the artist, get a fuller picture of what it is they're trying to build. On the right hand side, you can see examples of photo references where we'll actually take images from surgery or from cadavers, but we also mix it in with outside of the box visual imagery. So, for instance, here we're talking about how the glands in the breast tissue are aligned. They're described as having a kind of a radial spiral pattern. So, what better way to show the artists, how they should sit within that space than showing, an actual uh, radial spiral itself? So, I'm now going to pass you on over to Gus, who's going to talk about now the 3D process.
Thanks very much, Aaron. So after the medical team did all the research, the real creative fun begins. So we receiving these medical briefs and trying to understand exactly how to represent it. And we have very specific stages to create these assets. First, we're going to create an early prototype, making sure we understand it in 3D space, how this fits into the human body. In this case study, we're going to look at the human heart. In the first image, you can see that we're creating a very kind of early, very basic prototype that helps us to understand what we're trying to achieve here. And we start working on that. During this process, each step of the way, we actually rely on the medical team, make sure that we understand every intricate detail and build this kind of foundation step by step. We start creating a detail test, trying to understand how the different textures, different materials are going to work, like in the heart's case, how the fatty tissue, the ligaments, or the muscles are going to interact with each other, and try to be very purposeful with our design. We start adding colors, making sure that they are very clear, the individual elements, and that's one of our design philosophy to have this clarity represented in our design work. After that, we also have to consider cut and functionality, which is partly have to be a model that is very interactive, but also we're trying to base this on like real life dissection. So we know what our customer or user is going to actually have to study and how they study that from real life examples. On the next slide, we're going to show exactly how this happens. So when we start detailing, we try to use many references, and we are trying to make sure that we actually handcraft all the details to create something that is much more easy to see and understand. So instead of just using different texture references, we handcraft every intricate detail. On the next slide, you can actually see how that our creation process really helps us to create something that users want to interact with. They cannot clearly see what's going on. It's a bit more full of life, and we're trying to always create an asset that is actually inviting for the user. Something it's like a little bit of an eye candy. So we're trying to avoid creating gory assets that actually kind of like, oh, I don't want to actually discover object. We want to invite people to actually see, understand, and learn from these objects. On the next slide, you will see that how, for example, the heart from these steps building up, how it actually was delivered. And there are a couple of renders with different scenarios how we can reuse this model. And that's one of the kind of core principle that we trying to create our assets that can be used in multiple use cases that we're going to talk about in a minute. But also, that's not really the end of the life of a model. On the next slide, you're going to see that after that, we're going to hand it out to our one of our animators, very talented individual who trying to understand each of the steps, how this object, in this case the heart, operates and works, breaks it down to elements, and create complex animations. And that really helps us to have a very purposeful objects, which has very specific learning outcomes for the users. After that's when these animations are done, the models are going to deploy it in several ways. On the next slide, you're going to see that first of all, it's going to be released in complete anatomy. When you have a fully interactive 3D model, it's a beating heart that can be stopped and can be completely discovered in 3D. All the different parts can be hidden or exposed or isolated. And we also have, of course, the written content that the medical team is looking after. So this is the first time when the whole process actually is being finished, and all the written content and the 3D art is actually coming together in a very educational way. But beside that, we use the same assets to create animation renders. There are limitations in the app that we can do, and sometimes we have to use more complex animation to explain a pathology or actually a procedure. And beside that, all models are also ready for VR and AR use cases as well, which is, well, obviously that's something that is very important for us, and also creating different prototypes. Moving on, I want to talk about the second case study, and it's really that kind of deep philosophy and methodology about behind our modeling. I'm going to talk about how we created the human skull. And first of all, this is a project that Aaron and myself were heavily involved. It's incredibly complex, and we reviewed what's out there, and what could be possible. And early on, we realized that we need something much more advanced. First of all, I had the advantage that so-called beginner's eyes and beginner's mindset, that I didn't really understand what's going on. So Aaron, as an expert, was able to explain all the intricate details of the human skull. And we actually sourced a real human skull as an intact one, and also a disarticulated one. So we can review all the bits and all the different bone parts and understand exactly what the different landmarks are going to represent, how to articulate with each other, and how to create the human skull. In this case, we actually have a very specific process when we use artistic principles and actually mixing it together and collaborating with science. On the next slide, you're going to see how that happens. A lot of people might be familiar with how in art we use primary, secondary, and tertiary shapes. We pioneered the workflow when we actually very purposefully use this as check-in points, talking with the medical team and making sure that each stages are used in collaboration with science. On the next slide, I would like to talk you through the first step, which is the primary shapes. This is where you define your foundation. You always have to keep in mind that this is your first read. You will always see this. That's why it's very important to get these measurements right and the proportions, because if everything is off here, your design is going to fall apart. This is our foundation. We have to make sure that everything is pretty much set in stone, but there is always a little bit of leeway to make things work. After that, we move on to the secondary shapes. This is your second read, when actually those intricate relationships between the different shapes are being established, making sure that there's a foundation, a structure, a visual architecture behind it. And we use this basically as our ABC, trying to understand how, spell it out to the user, how this set of bones function, what's the purpose of it, without they having access to the written content. Meanwhile, when they're going to have the written content, they can be exactly identify those structures and relationships. This is the part when we establish the overall structure and an overall feel to it, and then we move into the tertiary shapes and tertiary details, when we actually really add up those imperfections to the skull, like asymmetry or the more like organic field, and also create tiny little intricate details that actually tells a deeper story. And it's these steps, all of them build on each other. So each of the way you're going to always see your previous decisions, and that's why they have to be very collaborative and coming from understanding. When the tertiary shapes are done, on the next slide, we're going to actually show that there's a bit of back and forth. And I think that's really well summarizing what happens between the medical and the 3D team. There are very specific real life measurements that we're trying to use as accurately as possible, but we also use artistic proportion and measurements as well. We want to create something that's accurate, but we want to have a balance. We want to make sure that aesthetically it's pleasing, it's easy to read, and easy to understand. On the next slide, I just want to break down exactly how we approach this. So if you think about it, the skull is built up from several very, very highly detailed individual bones. We're trying to use as many references as possible. And if you think about it, what kind of references are they that the students can use nowadays? There's real life, which is pretty good, but to be honest, most of the specimens are fairly old. They're kind of hard to understand and read. They are good, but not really accessible for a lot of people. MRI scans are more widely available, but they're usually low quality and low detail. They're more interactive, but they're not really perfect. However, plastic models are handy as well. They're easier to combine, but they lack that detail. Meanwhile, illustration usually have that beautiful crispness and clarity that we're really aiming for. We're trying to cherry pick all the features of these real life MRI scan, plastic model, and illustration and merge it in together. The clarity of the illustration, the interaction of the MRI scans and plastic model, and the accuracy of the real life. And that's really kind of helps us to create something better. Here you can see the ethmoid bone, for example, the very first iteration of it, which is very poor, but it was a beginning. But that just shows just having the conversation between artists and medical scientists, understanding how the different bone articulation work really adds to detail and understanding and clarity to the model. If you look at it as an artist, you only see the detail, but in reality, it's actually a foundation for like a first year medical student to understand the bone and how it articulates with all the surrounding bones. But also in the second year, students are going to understand how that's going to work in a more complex way, especially if it's actually forms a region. Because one of our challenges was that not only we had to build the bones individually and as a whole, but they also had to work as regions, as there's a lot of educational value understanding the different parts of the skull. On the next slide, you can see how that actually becomes even more complex, as we had to also consider what's the bone thickness between the surfaces. So if we're going to be doing creating a cross section, how that's going to affect the bones as a whole. So you can see that there's multiple levels and layers of complexity here. And not to talk about that, we also have to make sure, for example, the sinuses, which is a negative space, how that's going to work. On the next slide, you can see exactly how the project actually finished. And I hope you will be able to see that even though it's a highly detailed skull, you still see the clarity of the primary and the secondary shapes. So instead of the like micro detail, the tertiary shapes not distracting, but actually build and add to it. Each individual parts tell a story. If you look at the different parts, you can actually understand it better, and it's not becoming noisy, but still clear and easy to read. On the next slide, I would like to show why it is very important. We have to get everything right and accurately because we have to build very complex structures on it. Like you see, the larynx is actually incredibly intricate and complex connections of muscles, and they have all bony attachments. And we had to make sure that everything is cross-measured, everything is accurate, because as we can build a very, very, very accurate model and educational material. And of course, all the facial muscles, for example, and vessels will built in that as well. On the next slide, you're going to see that actually has a more deeper meaning to this, why we actually have to get it right. When you look at all the blood vessels, nerves, for example, they all have very specific grooves, very specific holes they have to go through. We had to make sure that it's all easy to understand. But more importantly, when the students have access to these models, when they read through the written material, we have to make sure that they will going to have access with the written text to a 3D representation. And that's incredibly powerful because you create this incredibly complex structure and you boil it down to something simple. And the students, when they read through it, they actually see it there. And that's really like how you create a really premium product when everything is there what you need for a learning outcome. And moving on to the next slide is when we actually finish with the process for a skull, when we hand it over to the medical team. And that's not, as usually, it's not the end of the lifespan of a model. Then there's more magic happens in the background. Handing it back to you, Aaron.
Thanks, Gus. So it's really a testament to the quality of the 3D models and the work that Gus and his team do that after the models are built, we then use technology to empower the models with, more meaning and more information and value for students and our users. So here in this example, this is some of the technology we use to paint on, points of interest onto the bones, almost like a form of Google Maps. But we can do this over and over again. So on the top left, you have the parts of the bones, then the surfaces, then the landmarks, the craniometric points, the sutures, and even the foramina and the negative spaces in between, which are also very important for students to know. There's no way we could cover all of these points of interest unless, of course, the model itself, was accurate and clear to understand. Um, so I could go on further and talk about some more applications of technology, but I think that might be a little bit outside the remit of this presentation. So really, to summarize, our goal is to really make medical education appealing, for future generations, and we try to do that by opening up the science and showing people, the beauty and the art behind it. And we do that really by communicating and collaborating. The medical team break down really difficult to understand concepts, and the 3D team over time have really picked up a lot of the scientific jargon that we use. It's almost a second language, being able to talk in terms of anatomy, to know your anterior, posterior from your posterolateral aspects, and really take that information and then create these models. And I think the reason that we've been successful up until this point, or part of the reason, is because we're a very psychologically safe team. During that project where Gus and I worked on the skull together, we were both empowered to be honest with each other, to take risks and just experiment and have fun, but realize that both of our intentions was to make a great product. So that's really it. Thank you very much for your time today.
Wow, thank you so much, Gus and Aaron, for this presentation. There's so many really good messages on the chat about this impressive work, and I mean, there's so many things to unpack from what you just said, because on and I'll start with that last thing that you said, Aaron, that you're like scientists and artists are working together that started speaking very different languages, and in a way you found a way to speak the same language, not only the artist understanding the medical terms, but through this kind of visual communication, or being able to just communicate through these artistic mediums, has allowed you to really create the product that you want.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember back maybe in the early days, we ended up having educational sessions with each other. Maybe one of the medical team would have a lecture on all the different anatomical terms, but in equal measure. I remember sitting in on lectures from the 3D team explaining some of the most basic stuff, because the medical team didn't have a clue at what maybe even UV mapping was, or even something as simple as a vertice. But it was important to understand the 3D elements, because otherwise we don't know what the limitations are, or we don't know what's possible. So it was important to maybe bridge that gap.
Can I add to that? That I believe that we are very lucky not to have that knowledge, because it didn't come with expectations. We had to pioneer something brand new and come from understanding. Aaron touched on that we're a very psychologically safe group, and I know that being kind of thrown around nowadays in a corporate world, but it's really the foundation of scientists and scientists coming together. And there's no judgment. There are no stupid questions. We always say that. I always felt that me understanding it and not knowing and understanding step by step from the medical team, it really helps me to understand someone as a user going to see the same product, and they have to understand and discover it for the first time. So actually we use this kind of not knowing to our advantage, and I think it's a very, very special skill to have that not many people talk about.
Yeah, definitely. Being psychological safe when you're going through these kind of projects, and it is really hard, right? Especially when you're trying to bring these new mediums into the process, right? You have artists that are designing in certain mediums, you have scientists working with other ones, and they never cross over, right? And there's even kind of all of these social aspects that make people kind of really nervous about some people are very nervous about sketching something, because at some point in our life somebody told us you're really bad at just being artistic, never do it. And then, like, so you have all these different barriers. So it's really kind of like inspiring to hear of a team that has allowed for all of these to disappear and just be able to open up. But I'm wondering, what are the tools that you're actually using to communicate? Because right now you showed us a lot of kind of like the work and some of the prototypes that you were doing over the phase of the project. But how are you actually collaborating, communicating? Is it still very much kind of like through presentations like this one?
Certainly before COVID, the general framework would have been that the medical team would have used any kind of visual means to communicate the anatomy to the artists. Like, the 3D team were very visual, so we communicate in visual ways. You can see from some of those images I showed earlier, it's a lot of different images with a lot of drawings over it, with lines to different pieces of text, and just a lot of exposition. And that still continues now post-COVID, where a lot of us are now working remotely still. But the important part is that we can jump on a Zoom call now, and Zoom can offer the medical team the ability to draw on the screen something so simple, but it makes such a difference in terms of providing feedback. And in another instance, we have in situations or cases where some of the medical team are picking up 3D tools themselves to work on the models and provide feedback. So that's a really nice evolution to see.
And I want to add to that I think that was one of our biggest challenge, that some of the medical team didn't really find it challenging to actually visualize the end product in 3D. And even when they saw the early stages, when you see the primary and secondary shapes, they were unsure how that's going to turn out. And the blessing was that understanding that happens, to the other party on our side, from a 3D side, but to the medical team, that helped us to plan. And we always know that we have to do micro projects and see what worked for the individual. So it was more highly customized. I was lucky enough, I worked most with Aaron, he picked it off instantly, but there were others who actually struggled with it. As soon as you understand what they struggle with and go walk them through the project, even with a micro project, and they see how it comes together, it clicks. It's mainly, there are so many tools available nowadays, but it's really understanding how to communicate with the other party. And that's actually where our tools becoming very effective. Just want to say that, ironically, having COVID and lockdown, we were based in Ireland, and we had very strict lockdown for up to 2 years. And that really helped the team to have a much more kind of collaborative and more online presence and online collaboration, which also meant that voices that were not heard in the past, they were getting louder. And we had actually much better opportunities to have more conversation online than we ever had in person, which is kind of interesting to see how that worked out.
Yeah, that's really. And how was it all through Zoom and kind of like being able to communicate like that mostly, or?
It was mainly on Zoom in our case. We wish we had better tools, to be honest, but we had a couple of big releases. One of the things that you have to consider that during COVID, it was especially, there were no access to cadavers, for example. We were just working on the female model that's actually the world most accurate and groundbreaking model. And we had to just go with it and just kind of create our own methods and tools while we're working on it. But that's something we're investigating to get better processes. And we're really, really excited to getting actually more like a virtual environment, because our end product is really 3D, and it really helps us to actually establish better ones. But at the moment, we just had to make it work, and we had to create something delivered as soon as possible.
How do you mock things up? Like, how do you get started? Of course, you showed us kind of like all the different stages, the primary, the secondary, and tertiary, elements, shapes. But then, do you start with just kind of like doodling something around, or is it more kind of like a series of imagery that you put together, or do you actually make things physical? What's the initial part of the process?
On the 3D side, we have kind of like a methodology that we're trying to get something in 3D as soon as possible, just to that creating that prototype stage to see how that's going to fit. In our case, we have a whole gross anatomy model, so there are lots of limitations that we have to work with. So we kind of create a very, very, very basic mock-up, and we can actually review it that internally in our internal system. But it's really not to put more time than absolutely essential at the current stage. So we never go into details. We only go into what we like to refer to as first principles, like in the heart. Okay, there are the valves, how they're going to work. Or there are the aorta, how it's going to go into it. So we have to answer in a prototype the big questions, the most important questions, the foundations first, and never go into detail until those are established. Aaron, what do you think of what's on your side, your view on this?
Yeah, so I think you kind of mentioned that there's a lot of limitations whenever it comes to gross anatomy. It's unfortunately, we're not free to just model out several different structures and kind of place them roughly where they should be. If you go to the anatomical textbooks, you will be told exactly where these objects and organs and individual parts of organs should sit, because anatomy is all about relationships from one point to another, and that's exactly what students have to learn. So as Gus says, the sooner we get something in 3D and throw it out there for review, we can then begin to measure it against maybe MRI scans and be able to judge whether or not we are hitting off those very important, anatomical landmarks. So it's a lot of creativity, and then it's also a lot of scoping it back so it fits within a certain framework, and probably a lot of headaches in between.
Yeah, it sounds like, but yeah, imagine once you get it right, it must feel so good.
Yeah.
All right, I'll ask a few questions from the audience. Will any of your work be accessible to / affordable for general public?
Yeah, I think somebody might have put a link in the chat there to our main website, but Complete Anatomy is available on the App Store, and be it iOS or Android. Now, Complete Anatomy has both a B2B kind of market to where it's being sold to institutions and like universities, but there is also a B2C market where people can buy an individual license.
Okay.
And just want to say that I have artist friends who actually love to use it because we have, for example, muscle motions that are really, really helpful for riggers and really helpful for animators to figure out exactly which muscle moves which way. So if you're an artist, please feel free to there's a try version, see if it is for you. And if you have any feedback for us as well, please feel free to reach out on our social media to us.
We have plenty of those in this session, so definitely some of them might reach out. I wonder if there are any MRI outputs you can use to build on in addition to 2D assets and traditional illustrations.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, the whole idea around MRIs, because any MRI data, so we would work an awful lot with medical professionals and subject matter experts, and sometimes we might be lucky to get MRI data to use as a reference. And sometimes that MRI data can be, segmented and turned into a 3D object, but it's never ever used in the actual complete anatomy model because that MRI data belongs to somebody, and there's a very big issue around consent and obviously ethical rights for reuse of this kind of information. So you do get some 3D digital companies out there who create anatomical bodies based off scans. But I think, Gus, you mentioned how MRI data, when it's converted to 3D, can be a little bit bulky and it needs to be cleaned up an awful lot. I think what we do instead is you guys model it freehand based on various different reference points. And we're almost creating something a little bit more like a really nice illustration in 3D.
Yeah, I personally, MRI scans have their benefits, but I take it with a big pinch of salt. They answer some questions, but they don't tell the whole story. I do think our assets are so high quality and next level because they're coming from clarity and understanding. By clarity, I mean that when an artist understands the shapes, but also understands the subject, he's able to construct something that actually how the user are going to interact with. An MRI scan is someone's own kind of evolution, its growth, it's how it's actually evolved during the years as the person was growing. It might be affected, You have to also consider that 99% of the MRIs, they actually had some sort of disease or pathology that actually had to be reviewed. So they are not healthy specimens. But at the core, we're trying to communicate information. It's not only about realism, but simplification. And so you get a really good asset when you cannot add or take away from it. That is just very purposeful. It communicates exactly what the student or an end user has to know. With MRI scan, it becomes very noisy and hard to read sometimes. And I personally take it with a big pinch of salt.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's kind of like this very crazy balance that you're having to do in making something very realistic so that the students can actually learn from it, but then also making it simple enough so it's not scary, as you were saying, or kind of like nobody wants to actually explore it. So, can the models be dissected in VR?
So I'm going to give you a really terrible answer. They can be. We do have capabilities, not in the app right now, but we do have capabilities to actually put the model in VR and have the same kind of functions to hide structures and phase structures and move structures. So VR is definitely something which is going to be a big talking point in the next few years around medical education. We're going to have more and more universities and institutions looking to have some kind of VR, element. So it's an area we are exploring, but as it currently stands, no, nothing's publicly available.
That's true, but we didn't really went into the themes, but we are artists from video games and VFX industry, and we're super big fan of VR and AR, and all of our assets are actually pretty much day one ready for it. They look actually quite high quality when you see the renders, but we all use game, basically creating normal maps, diffuse textures, and all that kind of like make it more expensive looking, even though the poly count is quite low, the texture resolution is too low. So we're ready for it. But as with everything, we don't feel that we can get the best learning outcomes in VR at this point. It's still being actually figured out on our side as well. And we won't put our product on the market for the sake of saying that we have a VR product. Many companies do that. And we want to get it right with everything. It's and I want to just mention and give a shout out to our amazing product, UX, and developer who are all this big team passionately working on something, creating something special. So we're waiting, but we're preparing, and we're more than ready for it. But when the time comes, hopefully we will come back and we can talk about it in more detail.
For sure. One thing that I would suggest is like using VR for communicating within your team, but we can talk about this offline. Can the models be oh no, this one I read already. Will a doctor be able to show a patient their scan in VR overlaid on your model?
So
comparing it to the model, but like their own scan.
Yeah. The primary goal or the primary market of complete anatomy is for education. So you're mainly going to see it for students of anatomy and educators of anatomy and medical science. However, we do have a professional license, and we have found that a lot of medical professionals like to use complete anatomy as an adjunct to their actual clinical sessions, so they can better explain information to patients. We certainly explored that avenue in the past, but mainly complete anatomy is education. So it's interesting to see how other people are using it, though.
I think that the capability is there, and it's up to the user. I saw use cases. It's very powerful because you have your 2D images or a scan, and you don't necessarily have to have it in the app, but showing those structures in 3D, it's really like an aha moment. So it's incredibly powerful. But I always feel with 3D assets, that's the real power of it. That then something can be used in so many ways. And I think one of the best example, like someone has knee surgery, the app is really good to explain it because you can hide the different bones and show the ligaments, for example. And actually you can simulate, just like it's not a proper dissection, but you can have the cut tool, for example, and so how they're going to have a procedure. So the capability is there, but it's come down to the end user how they're using it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that would be a much better way of showing it sometimes than the kind of like figures that they have in the in their offices. Can you also talk more about ethnicity outside of visual representation? What differences do you find between the diversity of ethnicities?
Well, so that the diversity release, it hasn't been released yet, but we're hoping it will be released this month, and it's been the biggest project we've been working on for the last year. So a lot of time and effort has gone into that project because it's a very big topic, and it's a topic we kind of want to get right. During the process of the topic, we have been consulting different subject matter experts in the fields of anthropology, just to ensure that we're on the right track. Gus, you probably worked in this project a little bit more than me, but I would say that. So feel free to jump in, but I would say we kind of took the approach that we're not looking to make individuals of specific geographical backgrounds. We're looking just to make a very large swath of the population, so that what you'll see as the end product is several different models, different phenotypes of different facial features, which have no specific geographical background, and then the ability to put on different skin tones. And what you find is we've created maybe a large group of models, which hopefully will be representative of a lot of different people. That's the goal.
I have to be honest, it was one of the most challenging but most rewarding projects we ever worked on. I was heavily involved, and it's one of those, when you start out with a question, how are you going to represent, I don't know, 3 billion people on Earth? You can't. How are you going to make those changes? Who are included? You can't. And you had to be very, very thoughtful about it. And we had many conversations, as Aaron mentioned, SMEs, that experts, to explain what their thoughts about it. It's something that no one ever did before. Everybody shies away from it. And we are kind of like, we looked at it as it is exciting, but there are lots of, like problematic decisions can be made. So we're trying to make sure that we make the best quote unquote compromises to represent as many people as we can. We believe that we strike the balance that actually really helps. And we also didn't want to create something that says like, oh, there's a huge analytical differences between different regions, because the reality is that actually there's bigger differences like anatomical variation in a small region sometimes than in a wider. This is a bit more complex and it's out of scope, but it's an incredibly interesting conversation to have. And I'm very excited because we're going to be the first one to actually introduce that. We totally appreciate that there are risks behind it, but it's the right thing to do, and we really strongly believe in it, and incredibly proud of this release. We can't talk too much about it. It's going to be released probably next week, but please keep an eye on it. And again, on social anywhere, reach out to us if you have any feedback, any thoughts about it, because we love to talk to our audience and our users.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think on behalf of everyone, that it's not kind of like the typical person that gets kind of like in these anatomy books. Yeah, thank you for this.
Definitely not.
And yeah, there's like obviously a lot of risks, but I think the benefits of starting to put something like this out there, at least starting the conversation, pushing the barriers, is really important. So there's probably a lot of work that needs to be done further down, but somebody has to start. So thank you for that. And then I have one last question here from the audience, from Marcus Marino. What is your 3D software pipeline? Gravity Sketch, I don't think you're using Gravity Sketch. SubD, Nerves, what is it that you're using? Which tools?
Aaron, would you like to take that? I'm only joking. I'm a 3D artist here. Well, we are very open-minded, and there are different team members who use different things. We mainly use 3ds Max because it's really easy to organize the structures there, and we have thousands and thousands of objects. But realistically, we love to use ZBrush because it gives us the artistic freedom. Use 3ds Max for retopology, creating the UVs, a lot of optimization. That's core part. Organization and optimization, of course, of our workflow. And then we love to use Substance. We have a very passionate Blender user in the team, which all that team is buzzing because it's it's an amazing tool, and we're wholeheartedly recommend. And we are very open-minded. We're always trying to do some process innovation and experiment with different tools. Also, different projects require different experiments. It's very different when we talk about diversity compared to the human skull. So It's a lot of experimentation, but it's relatively industry standard at its core. ZBrush, 3ds Max, Substance, and yeah, and it's more like the real-time video game workflow process.